Martha Tettenborn is a registered dietitian and certified primal health coach with over 30 years of experience working, it sounds like, in many areas of nutrition and wellness. And she's our guest today. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't often have dietitians or nutritionists. I think this might be actually the first of either that has been on the show. And that is because in my experience, their education, their view on nutrition and behavior change sometimes is a bit boilerplate and doesn't necessarily mesh with my approach as a wellness coach and my experience in the fitness industry. But Martha has a unique story and a unique lens, so I'm excited to have her here. And Martha, at the age of 58, was diagnosed with stage 1 ovarian cancer. And a response that I can respect as someone with a chronic illness who did the same thing. She started diving into the research and diving specifically into the concept of cancer metabolism, which we're going to talk about a whole bunch, I bet. But that experience led her to approach her own cancer treatment from a lifestyle lens, and by meeting that experience with what sounds like a lot of resilience and love and respect for her body, which I also can really respect. So like many of our guests, she then turned that combination of her professional knowledge, her personal wisdom, into a passion for helping others. Her book is Hacking Chemo, using the Ketogenic Diet, Therapeutic Fasting, and a Kickass Attitude to power through cancer. I'm excited to talk about all of that. Martha Tettenborn, welcome to Better Than Fine.
Thank you, Darlene. It's wonderful to be here with you today.
Well, let's just start with, in your book and in your bio, you mentioned this concept of cancer metabolism, and I'm betting most of our listeners are not going to be familiar with that term. Can you explain what that means and what it is?
Sure. Most medical professionals aren't terribly familiar with cancer metabolism either. And that was why it kind of came out of left field and hit me like a brick across the head when I finally discovered it. So back about 100 years ago, there was a lot of research being done on how bodies fuel themselves and how cells fuel themselves. This is before we had any way to see inside a cell and knew about mitochondria or anything like that. And even the concept of nutrients was pretty new, carbohydrates and fats and so on. People thought in terms of food, not in terms of nutrients or vitamins. Most of the vitamins hadn't even been kind of recognized yet. So there was a scientist who was doing work on how cancer cells seem to use their fuel differently than regular cells. And he determined that there was actually a different metabolic process taking place in most cancer cells. Unfortunately, that science was lost, partly because he was a German doing his research in between the two world wars and during the rise of Nazism in Germany and so on. And he was a Jew. So his story is actually rather amazing. His name was Otto Warburg, and his science was basically lost, as was a lot of really important German science after the Second World War. I mean, they lost. So everything that was German was like not valid. And of course, published in German, so nobody wanted to read it. And shortly after after the wars, Watson and Crick were able to visualize and describe DNA. And then it became obvious that the DNA in cancer was different. It was damaged. And that became the focus of cancer treatment. So everybody seemed to think that that was the cause of the problem. And metabolism of cancer just got tossed onto the dust heap of history. And the entire multi-trillion-dollar machinery of cancer treatment is all focused pretty much on cancer genetics, coming at it from that perspective. It's only in the last 20 years or so, maybe even 10 years, that there's been significant amount of research starting up again on cancer's disordered or different metabolism. And when you talk about metabolism, you're talking about fuel utilization, and fuel is food. So, I mean, it comes right back to nutrition, which is my bailiwick.
Yeah. Say that word again, bailiwick.
Is that a really old fashioned word?
No, I was assuming it was a Canadian word.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe. I mean,
Mm.
that's nutrition is kind of my passion. It's what I've done for my career, but it's also where I spend my spare time. So,
Don't move away from bailiwick. I want to internalize bailiwick. What a fantastic set of syllables. But I want to circle back for a second and just highlight what some of the things that you just said, which part of it is I find that very often an assertion in the fitness industry of like, oh, we know what we're doing. And nutrition science and metabolism and the ways in which what we put in our faces affects our bodies is so young.
oh
And
God, yeah.
I remember saying to clients years ago, and at some point I stopped saying it, that like, I don't want to be the third heart transplant patient. I definitely, I'm not tinkering too hard in like the fringes of nutrition hacking because it's so young and we want to assert like we know what we're doing, but it really is only a couple of decades out that we're talking about some of these concepts is the first thing that comes up to mind. And the second thing is that people want to pretend that, I mean, maybe not since in the last 2 years, but I feel like before the last 2 years, we pretend that science is supposed to be ideologically apolitical. But this is not the first time in recent history I've heard of science from the post-World War, science from like the World War II era in Germany getting torched. And then we're like, no, we know what we're doing in the West. And so we kind of shun that era's research. And in actuality, there's these ideas, these kernels of wisdom that we're ignoring. And this is just one more example.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Einstein came out of that period. And in fact, he was a family friend of the Warburgs, right? Fascinating stuff. A really good example of that is the whole issue of ketones, right? Ketones were not even known or taught. I mean, we knew that ketones happened in your body if you went into diabetic ketoacidosis and you could die from them. But ketones as a fuel source was totally unknown. I graduated in '84 from university in nutrition, and we never once talked about ketones. There was protein, carbs, fats, that's it. Alcohol, those were the only calorie sources. And we literally didn't know. So that whole science is so new.
And to chime in on that, I got my nutrition coaching certification, my first one, 8 years ago, and we didn't learn about ketones. I think it was a footnote about, like you say, about diabetics. Like, oh, watch out for this. I think now that certification has been rewritten and now includes some information about ketosis. Just can you quickly explain just what ketosis is for the benefit of the listener?
Absolutely. So ketones are another fuel source. They are water soluble. They are made in your body, usually in your liver, from base materials, which is the other nutrients that you have in your body, or from your stored body fat. And they are an alternative to glucose in your blood. So normally our cells will burn either glucose, which is the blood sugar version of sugar and starches. Okay. Or we can burn fatty acids, which are the breakdown products of fats that either come from our diet or that come from our own body stores. But fatty acids are fat soluble. They don't dissolve, or they can't be carried in blood without being packaged up in some way that allows them to be dissolved or to float in blood. Right?
I'm geeking out for just a second that in all the time that I have thought about human bodies and metabolisms, it just never clicked for me before that, like, oh, right, fat soluble isn't going to be in blood without a transport molecule. That's really funny that it just never occurred to me before. Please continue.
You know what? That's what HDL and LDL is. When you talk about those different kinds of cholesterols, those are the transport molecules.
Yeah.
Right? So we identify cholesterol by the transport molecule that is being carried by. So fatty acids are actually carried around by HDL and LDL cholesterol, molecules that carry the cholesterol as well. But ketones are water soluble. And so they're small little molecules that can go right into the transport chains or the metabolism chains inside your cells that use glucose otherwise, or fatty acids, and they can go into the same energy producing metabolic pathway and produce energy. One of the really important things that ketones could do is that they can cross the blood-brain barrier, so that protection that's around your brain. And they are actually an excellent fuel source for the brain. In fact, that's why back in the 1920s, a ketogenic diet was used to treat epilepsy for children who were not responding to any other source of medication or any other source of treatment.
The original Atkins diet, right?
Well, the Atkins diet wasn't really about ketones. I mean, he didn't know about ketones because we didn't know about them then.
Yep.
He just was one of the first people to acknowledge the fact that maybe carbohydrates weren't the best thing for our bodies, and that our current dietary pattern, which was so heavy on carbohydrates, because of us deciding that low fat was the only way the world should be, right? So he was very much ahead of the curve in terms of understanding the role of carbohydrates in obesity and cutting them out. But his approach was not as nuanced as we are now, right? So
he had less to go on, in his defense.
Absolutely, he had less to go on. Yeah. So yes, a ketogenic diet is really just a way of eating that encourages your body to produce ketones. You don't eat ketones.
I do know some people who supplement exogenous ketones so that so they can cheat and then also still get to stay in ketosis. I find that it makes my stomach hurt.
Described as throwing a bucket of someone else's sweat over your body and claiming you've had a really good workout. Isn't that a lovely thought?
Yeah.
The idea of ketones is that your blood sugar drops low enough that your body then produces this alternative, which is the ketones. And then you use the ketones where your body would otherwise use sugar. Most of us drop into mild ketosis every night when we sleep, and we don't wake up and eat for 8-10 hours or whatever. And so we all have that ability. Babies are born in ketosis. Breast milk has a high fat content enough that most babies spend at least some of their time in ketosis. So, I mean, it's not scary. We've made ketoacidosis, which is the diabetic condition where you have extremely high blood sugar and you have extremely high ketones, and none of that's getting anywhere that it's supposed to be because there's no insulin. And that's life-threatening. But ketosis is just the presence of ketones in your blood, and it's fine. And there is no one particular diet that gets you there, because it's really just about what's in your blood. Right. So people can be on a ketogenic diet that is, they all have to be low carb. That's kind of the only prescribed thing. But you could be a vegetarian in ketosis. You could be a carnivore in ketosis. You could be doing just, a fairly significant carb restriction, but what's now described as a keto diet, which includes animal products and dairy and fruit, and low carb vegetables and fruits. The fastest way to get into ketosis is to fast, which is no food, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, so it's not a diet that's described by a group of foods as opposed as it's a diet described by the effect it has.
Yeah, and the energy source that's functioning within your body. So to summarize, okay, in a normal, like in our current standard eating pattern that most people have, if they have not made the intentional effort to get into ketosis, their state is that their metabolism is functioning on primarily carbohydrates and occasionally fat metabolism. Like a ketogenic is a kind of fat metabolism, right? But we make some kind of shift. We make it, whether it's fasting or low carb or whatever. And then metabolically, you're flexible in a way that you slip into ketosis, ideally, unless something else is going on, which is a whole different rabbit hole we could go on. But to tie it back to our original nugget here, in your work within yourself, you came upon this body of evidence around cancer metabolism. We were burying the lead here, but then discovered some things around ketosis and cancer metabolism, right?
Yes, absolutely. I was already well into the low carb camp. I had been following that passion for probably 10 years, but I'd actually done some extra certification. I had a private practice going using low carb nutrition, made me a bit of a renegade in terms of a dietitian. But what I discovered is that cancer cells do not have the ability to use ketones for fuel, almost exclusively. It's not 100%, but pretty close. And that's because normal metabolic pathways take place inside a little organelle inside your cells called mitochondria. And there's a particular series of chemical reactions that take place. And they produce the actual energy currency of your cells, which is called ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. So whether you put in fatty acid pieces, whether you put in ketones, whether you put in glucose, you break down to fatty acid or to ATPs. Cancer cells appeared especially once we could see them under an electron microscope, that they have an actual structural damage to their mitochondria and they don't operate properly. And so the cancer cell seems to have reverted back to a much more primitive form of energy generation, and that's called fermentation. And it takes place not in the mitochondria, but in the actual fluid or the cytoplasm of the cell. And fermentation is a very fast breakdown of a glucose molecule into two parts. So instead of in the mitochondria where it goes through this pathway, and in the end you end up with water molecules and carbon dioxide molecules. And of course, the water is just part of your body. Carbon dioxide you breathe out. It's a very clean burning fuel. In fermentation, that glucose gets broken down into an acid, lactic acid, and energy is produced in that breakdown, but only a fraction of what actually happens when you use your proper metabolic, your mitochondria pathways. So a glucose molecule going through a mitochondria pathway will produce 36 ATPs. A glucose going through fermentation will produce 2.
Ooh.
Yeah, so it's a big difference, but it's instant fuel. Yeah. I mean, our bodies all have the ability to do this all the time. That's what, if you do high intensity exercise or your fight or flight sort of exercise.
That burn is,
Yes, that's the lactic acid, right? So your body's needing energy faster than you can make it. And so you flip back to this fermentation process. It's always there in all of us, but cancer uses it almost exclusively. And the other big thing about cancer is that it has no ability to turn itself off in response to a lack of fuel. Whereas healthy cells can downregulate themselves, turn themselves down, just kind of go into a maintenance holding mode, wait for the fuel supply to come back online. Cancer can't do that. And so they're hungry all the time.
So just a quick summary is that, our mitochondria, these little structures inside our cells, can use any of these fuel sources we're talking about to produce ATP, and ATP is what fuels literally everything your body ever does ever, right?
Yep.
On the flip side, a cancer cell only can use glucose and is a very inefficient reproduction, but it's fast fuel because those cells are essentially like running around with no brakes.
Right.
I think
so
the listener could intuit where we're leading you here. If you deprive the energy, the engine stops and then the cell dies, right?
Well, that's the thought. Yes. The fermentation process can also use glutamine, which is one of the basic amino acids. So it's not exclusively glucose, but it's mostly glucose.
Got it.
So yeah, the idea is that by starving the cancer cells, you stress them. I don't think it's ever going to kill them, but it stresses them. They can't grow the way they want to grow. They don't have the raw materials and the fuel for dividing, which is their the genetic imperative. That's what they have to do, right?
Yeah.
And so they're stressed, and then once they're stressed, they're more vulnerable, and that's where you hit them with a treatment.
Yeah.
right?
So then let's get into this idea. And I'm going to preface this question by just saying, like, when we throw around the word protocol as practitioners, we're just meaning like the behavior stacks that we recommend someone do to get a particular outcome, right? So like, I've got a particular protocol that I use when my gut feels out of balance to get my gut microbiota back into good functioning, steady
Yeah,
pooping. So you refer to your cancer fasting protocol. And I think that's where we're leading here is like, hey, there is some things that one can do to get into this state to make their cancer cells more vulnerable to treatment. Yes?
absolutely. Yeah. A lot of research in this area has been done by Dr. Thomas Seyfried at Boston College. And he proposes what he calls the press pulse theory, where you press or apply pressure, which is the stress, which is the ketogenic diet, which is, reducing the fuel supply for the cancer so that they're stressed and vulnerable. And then you pulse, which is you hit them with some kind of a treatment. So that could be chemo, it could be radiation, it could be high pressure or hyperbaric oxygen, it could be mistletoe. There's a variety of, both conventional and unconventional with air quotes.
We appreciate the air quotey unconventional on Better Than Fine.
Yeah. And so that the treatments then are enhanced. Their effect is more potent because the cancers are already vulnerable. Yeah. And that's the idea. One of the ideas that really helped me to form kind of where I wanted to go with my own response to my own cancer and how I wanted to use nutrition. The other researcher who's done a lot of work in this area is Dr. Walter Longo, who's in California. And he's actually a longevity specialist, but he has spent a lot of energy on cancer and cancer metabolism as well over the years. And he looked at fasting and how fasting would, again, stress the cancer cells, make chemotherapy more effective, and actually significantly reduce the side effects of chemotherapy. And that was kind of where it caught me and got me very excited, because I was completely healthy, consider myself completely healthy prior to this happening. I've had a blessed life, and I, at 58, I was strong. I wasn't taking a single medication. I was doing everything I wanted to do in life. Like, life was grand. And I strongly identified as that healthy person, particularly because I had this low carb private practice and I wanted to be able to help other people to, age awesomely, right? I didn't take a single medication. I slept as well as could be expected given that I'm in menopause. But this whole cancer thing kind of hit me out of the blue and really impacted on my sense of who I am, right? And so it was really this, and I'm totally drug naive. I mean, I hardly take a Tylenol, right? So to go into chemo was terrifying for me. When I read about particularly the side effects, like, yes, hit me with your best shot. I only intend to do this once. So like, give me whatever you need to give me to make sure that I'm only dealing with this once, right? But on the other hand, I started reading about things like peripheral neuropathy, nerve damage that could take months to come back, numbness in fingers and toes. And it's like, oh my God, I can't imagine not being able to walk and be active. I can't imagine my fingers being numb. I'm a knitter and I type for my job and my living. And it's like, no, those things just can't happen to me. So that was one of the big things about using particularly the fasting right around the chemo treatments, was to reduce those side effects. And I got to tell you, I was amazingly successful.
Yeah. I want to first just appreciate your vulnerability and sharing. This is a show where people end up talking about their chronic illness, which I always appreciate. But also just the fear and the identity moment, right? Because I think there's also that sense of, and I experienced this too as a wellness practitioner of, well, I should be this paragon of health, and I am healthy. And then you have something come up that challenges that identity, or there's always that, well, what did I do to get here? I was doing all the right things. And, to first thank you for sharing it, but also to recognize for all of us that like, that is not how these things work. And, we're all in the chaos system of the universe and things happen. It's then what we do with them. And it sounds like what you did with them was meet it with resilience and this, curiosity, look for answers, look for different outcomes mindset. I also want to just recognize that like all bodies are different. I know for me, if I do a ketogenic diet, I test my urine and nothing changed. I have to fast. And it is a lot of fasting for me to get into ketosis. Like that's just the way that my physiology seems to present in the world. Whereas like another person, looks at a steak and ignores potatoes and bam, they're there. And so it might not look all the same for each of us. Right.
No.
Right.
No.
Can you speak to that a
my
little
numbers
bit?
were never big. They would never impress anybody, but I knew I was in ketosis for the entire time I was in chemo. Right. But no, I
How
don't
did
get
you
big
know?
numbers
Can you
either.
talk about how you knew?
Yeah, I did blood testing. I have a blood glucose and ketone meter, and I would test my ketones at least once a day and sometimes twice a day, though the ketone sticks are stupid expensive.
Yeah.
But it was important for me to know, and the geek in me wanted to know, the data person wanted to know. So I kept track of everything. I kept track of my weight. I kept track of my blood sugars and my ketones and how I was feeling and all that kind of stuff. I kept a journal and, so that I had that experience kind of documented for myself. And like I say, I'm a geek when it comes to this stuff. I'm all about the data and every bit of lab work I've ever had, I've printed off and kept and tracked and, tracked my husband's, tracked my brother's.
Nice. We
got lab work. Oh, good. Give me.
Yeah. I want to look at your lab work.
Yeah.
We appreciate nerds here on this show. I'm not that kind of nerd, but my man person is. So I just let him like, you know what? That's your strength. Here you go, champ. Of course, many of the listeners to the show won't have cancers, but it's also been my experience as a practitioner that that's a thing that most people intentionally want to avoid. So Can you talk about the difference between fasting and cancer treatment versus eating in the rest of your life? And I'm assuming that there was a pivot there. And what does that look like for you?
Yeah. So I had been eating what I would describe as a moderate low carb diet with frequent forays into potato chips for probably years. I was very well fat adapted. I've never been slim. I probably carry 20 or so extra pounds beyond what society says I should carry, but
we're gonna unpack that.
Oh yeah. But mine's all on the surface. It's not visceral fat, which means that I'm jiggly in places I don't want to be jiggly, but I've come to accept that that's okay. I'm healthy and I'm strong and my body does everything I want it to do. So that's great. So that was the way I was eating for a long time. I've taken a lot of the crap out of my diet. And crap for me was sugar containing foods. And I must say that I'm not a sweet tooth, so that wasn't a big hardship for me. And the industrial seed oils, that was the other biggie in terms of taking.
Can you
crap
talk
out.
about that?
Yes, I certainly can.
Oh, please. The floor is yours.
All right. So there's a lot of information, even just in the last couple of years, just the last 2 or 3 years, about the role of industrially, agriculturally produced and manufactured in a factory type of oils. They've only been in our diet for about 100 years. And if you go back and look at how they ended up in our diet, it was all about the money. It was about using a waste product and creating a need, which is what advertising does. It's a fascinating story. And for anyone who's interested, I would just recommend that you look up Nina Teicholz anywhere on the internet, but particularly some of her talks on YouTube, or get her book, The Big Fat Surprise. Holy cow, it will blow your mind as to how our diet has been manipulated in the last 100 years, particularly with the addition of these seed oils. And also how the kind of the breadbasket of the US was producing all these big monocrops, and there's oil in those seeds. There's oil in soybeans, there's oil in corn, and so those, and canola, which is another one that's grown for its seed oil. But in order to extract the oil from those seeds and beans, you have to use incredibly complex industrial processes. It involves hexane solvents, it involves high heat, and these are unstable oils. These are unsaturated, which means that they have chemical bonds that are fragile. And so they get destroyed in this process. And then they get deodorized because they all have their own taste and smell, and nobody wants that. So when you buy a bottle of tasteless corn oil or soya oil or what's vegetable oil, again, the air quotes, right? Because they're not vegetables, they're grains. At the grocery store, you're getting this highly industrialized factory product that has never been part of the human food chain.
Until now.
Till the last 100 years, and look at the mess we're in.
Yeah.
Right. So people need to understand that every cell in your body has a membrane around it, and the membrane is what makes your cell work. And the membrane is made of fatty acids. And those fatty acids are, for the most part, short chain saturated fatty acids. And a saturated fatty acid, this is the other thing people need to know, is saturated fatty acid is a straight line. Okay, just imagine a straight line. An unsaturated fatty acid has a kink in it where the unsaturated bond is. And a trans fat is an unsaturated fat that a factory has turned into a saturated fat through a chemical process. But
they took the kink out.
It's not, no, but it doesn't really take the kink out. It straightens it out, but it straightens it out in an opposite direction to how your body's normal fatty acids work. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So they end up getting incorporated into places in your body that should have a nice straight line fatty acid, and they don't. And so all kinds of chronic disease is happening because these fatty acids that were never part of our food supply, or at least they weren't much of our food supply, particularly the trans fats, are getting incorporated into cells all over our body. And then the cells crap out, they're not working properly because the membrane doesn't work properly. So, and I mean, that works for your brain, for your nerves, for everything, right?
I'm now picturing, like, you know, the Tetris piece that's shaped like an L, and then there's like a backward L. I'm now picturing my body is trying to force the backward L-shaped Tetris piece into spaces that the other L is supposed to go.
Exactly. It's called cis and trans. There's two. So every chemical bond can either like bend to the left or bend to the right, and they're mirror images. They're not the same. You know, it's like your two hands are mirror images, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's what trans means, the trans fatty acid. It's bent in the wrong direction for what our body normally uses.
Well, and to tie this in for the listener, essentially what we're saying is that when we have low quality, high rancidity prone, but then chemically altered so that you can't smell that it's gone bad, highly chemically processed through multiple transport mediums that aren't really meant to be ingested by humans, from monocrops, et cetera, and then
that have been sprayed with all kinds of chemicals,
that have been imbued with all kinds of pesticides. You then ingest that junk and it becomes part of, wait for it, every single cell in your body. And it's not just in the cell, it is the membrane that is structuring the outside of that cell. And it's like a very weak bubble mixture, and you keep blowing bubbles, but they're all popping. That's what's happening. And it's causing increased cell turnover, increased aging, shorter telomeres, which are an indicator of cellular age, like inflammation. If your cells are reproducing faster, you are aging faster, right? So it's giving you, your body, a shorter shelf life because the manufacturers of your food want their foods to have a longer, cheaper shelf life. So you're paying the dividend. Yeah, you like that one?
Yeah, I like that one.
Give me credit. So essentially what we're saying is that your body being fat adapted, but also putting in healthful fats, because that allows your body to function better, literally at the cellular level.
Right. The fats that we evolved eating, basically.
Yeah.
Right. which, despite what some people like to think, was animals for the most part. Plants are available part of the year. The fruit of plants, like the high sugar parts, are available part of the year. And we gorged on them when we could as humans. I mean, as bears, as everybody else does, right? And they would make us fat, which would help us to get through the lean times, which is what allowed us to evolve. But we evolved most healthfully eating animals. Yeah. And right from 2.5 million years ago.
So Martha, if you are comfortable with it, I want to push back just a little bit, because I genuinely want your opinion on this. So my understanding of it, and granted, you have more knowledge of this subject than I do, which is why I want your opinion, that much of the research on ketosis that we currently have is relatively short-term studies, a lot of animal studies, a lot of them done on men. Do you have any concern about the long-term implications on women's health? And I've heard this tertiary. I have not personally dug into any of this evidence around affecting thyroid function, affecting autoimmune diseases, or hormonal complications affecting fertility issues. That, one way I've heard it put is that if your thyroid is generally functioning on carbohydrates, and then you're on these chronic low carb or ketogenic diets, is it causing thyroid dysfunction that then leads to hormonal dysfunction? So I've come across sources that feel very strongly about this, that even extended keto can cause, infertility or destabilizing fertility in young women. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I do. What I really think is that a ketogenic diet, one that is so low in carbohydrates that it puts your body into a state of ketosis, is a really powerful therapeutic tool. But it is not necessarily where you want to live your whole life. Okay, so yeah. And I really think that there are a lot of places where people can use ketosis for, like I did. For 5 months, I was in strict ketosis because I was actively fighting a cancer cell issue and I was taking chemotherapy. But that's not where I live my life. I live my life as a clean, mostly clean eater of animal-based and vegetable, what might be called paleo, but with dairy products. So, I mean, low carb, what was originally low carb healthy fats, LCHF, is kind of where I live my life, right? And there's not a lot of bread in my world. And if there is, it's occasional, and it's going to be something that is a low carb bread alternative. When we do have, my husband still eats carbohydrates, and when we do have them in the house, they are all organic because we are making a real effort to stay away from glyphosate and the chemicals that are used in particularly North American agriculture. But I can tell you, I can go to Europe or South America and I can eat all of the bread I want down there without any of the problems because they don't use as much glyphosate.
You know, what's fascinating is I have the same experience. I cannot drink beer in like the North American continent. But if I go to Italy and have a Peroni, I'm fine. If I have a Peroni here, my hands swell up like sausages. It's fascinating too. Isn't that horrible? Yeah. Like, yeah, my knuckles start to hurt. Like, obviously it's related to a genetic condition, but when I am in Europe, all the bread, all the pastries, no problem. I do that here. I am sick.
I went to Machu Picchu about 6 years ago, like to South America for 3 weeks with my best friend, and she can't eat gluten or wheat products here. And we talked about the glyphosate thing and said, like, we're going to be in a place where we don't have any control over what's fed to us because we were traveling for 3 weeks and doing the Inca Trail and all that stuff. So, try it. And we did. And their puffy white bread, which we were served like multiple times a day, was perfectly fine, caused no problems for either of us. And she's more sensitive to it than I am.
It's incredible.
But Yeah. And it's because they don't use, pre-harvest spraying of glyphosate on wheat crops and things that are done in North America.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this
Yeah.
is an opportunity to just say to the listener, when it comes to your food, getting curious, about where does this come from? What maybe has been put on it? Like one of the big conversations I've been having lately in my personal life is just about, you don't know what's on the inside of the packaging because I'm an American. Our government doesn't require a food manufacturer to list that in the ingredients. But whatever has been coated on the inside of the package to make stuff not stick, you're still ingesting that.
Yes, you are.
And you have no idea. And some of those things are definitely problematic. And so the more that we as informed consumers refuse to purchase these items, food manufacturers are going to do what food manufacturers do, but we get to decide what we're willing to accept. And also that's a form of privilege, right? Like not everyone gets that, but those of us who have that amount of flexibility, like let's start flexing those muscles, because otherwise we're not going to get this system to change.
Right. So going back to the keto thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really feel that ketosis can be a really powerful tool, but that's not a place that you need to spend your whole life. You don't need to chase the numbers. You don't need to be in ketosis. If you're choosing whole foods, a fairly ancestral sort of diet, like stuff that our grandparents and great grandparents would recognize as real food. That means meats, including traditionally cured meats. Like processed meat gets a really bad rap, but there's a big difference between industrially produced bologna and, the fermented, cured dry sausage that, Italians produce, right? Like soprassetto or something like that. Meats, eggs, dairy products are an agricultural product, but they've also been part of our diet for over 10,000 years. And particularly Caucasians who grew up in Northern Europe with, pastured animals and so on. Caucasians tend to have a pretty good tolerance for dairy products, but even so, like use fermented dairy products. I don't drink milk because it's got a lot of carbs and I just don't find I need it, but God help me, I've never met a cheese I didn't like. So can't imagine life without cheese.
Amen, my friend. It's like sugar is not my problem, but cheese.
Oh, cheese, yeah, butter, cream. If I eat a piece of pie, it's because of the whipped cream on top, It's like,
yeah. But I think this idea of looking to our however many generations you have to go back, because I know, for our younger audience, their grandparents were probably, in my case, my grandparents got really into a highly processed standard American diet. But if I look a generation back further, they were raising most of their own food. And then what you could store for the winter is the sweets that you got to eat over winter. And otherwise you weren't really eating a lot of sweet stuff unless, you were able to get your hands on sugar and you made the thing yourself, which meant that those baked things were pretty rare by and large.
The wealthiest families might have Sunday dinner,
a
pie for Sunday dinner or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even then it was the apples out of your basement.
Yep.
Out of your cold cellar. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we're looking to that as a template, it's a very different ratio of macronutrients than most of us are walking around with. But I also have to really appreciate that, like, literally the concern I've had about bringing someone on to talk about the ketogenic diet has been this glorification of like intermittent fasting forever, keto forever. And to hear your very balanced approach is refreshing.
They're tools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're tools like anything else.
Yep.
Well, I very much appreciate your balanced approach and your willingness to share your story with us. Martha's book is Hacking Chemo, Using the Ketogenic Diet, Therapeutic Fasting, and a Kickass Attitude to Power Through Cancer. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful to have a chat.
Absolutely a pleasure.